I'm Becca, and this is Deadly Truths, where history, horror, and humanity collide. This episode discusses real acts of violence, murder, and post-mortem mutilation that may be disturbing to some listeners. Listener discretion is advised. The analysis presented is based on historical records, investigative reports, and modern behavioral profiling. Individuals named as suspects were never convicted in a court of law, and references to them are made for historical and educational purposes only. This program does not sensationalize violence or assign legal guilt, but examines documented facts, systemic failures, and unresolved questions surrounding historical crimes. Tonight, we're not in Hollywood. We're not chasing glamour, rumors, or famous faces. We're standing in the shadows of 1930s America, where bodies were cut apart, heads disappeared, and the killer was never named. This isn't a story about who mattered. It's a story about who didn't and what that allowed. Before there was the Black Dahlia, there were the bodies, headless, dismembered, left where they'd be found. And the man in charge of stopping it, the most famous lawman in America. He'd taken down Capone. He was untouchable, and he failed. Not quietly, not privately. He failed while the bodies kept appearing. Kingsbury Run wasn't a neighborhood. It was a scar, a stretch of railroad tracks, shacks made of scrap wood and tin, smoke hanging low, the river nearby swallowing whatever the city didn't want to deal with. This is where the bodies surfaced. Torsos dumped like refuse, cleaned, cut, arranged, no names, no witnesses who would be believed. And every time a body was found here, it sent the same message. You can burn the shanty towns, you can raid the camps, you can parade a legend in front of the cameras, but I know exactly where to kill, and I know exactly who won't be missed. So let's dig into this terrible and horrific story. Panic spread quietly, not with sirens, but with whispers, because everyone understood something worse than a murderer was at work. Someone who had learned the system, learned where police wouldn't look hard, learned which victims would be dismissed, learned that if you kill people no one claims, you can take your time. And while Cleveland argued over jurisdiction, burned shanty towns, and rounded up the desperate, the killer kept refining his process, turning human beings into objects and proving with every new torso that this wasn't chaos. It was practice. Of all the bodies pulled from Cleveland's rivers, rail yards, and wasteland, only a handful were ever given their names back. And even that came with limits. The murderer wasn't targeting faceless figures by accident. He was choosing people whose lives already existed in the shadows, knowing that even when their names were known, the system would still look away. The killings began quietly in September 1934, when two dismembered bodies were found months apart but later understood to be connected. An unidentified woman, nicknamed the Lady of the Lake, and an unidentified man whose torso surfaced nearby. Both were decapitated, both dismembered, and neither was ever named. The city didn't yet understand what it was seeing. In September 1935, the pattern became undeniable when Edward Andraschi, a 29-year-old bartender, was found near Kingsbury Run. He had been castrated, decapitated, and dismembered with clean cuts. His head never recovered. Just 2 weeks later, another male torso was discovered, unidentified but similarly mutilated, confirming this wasn't an isolated crime but a developing method. In January 1936, parts of a woman's body were pulled from the Cuyahoga River. Investigators believed she had been killed weeks earlier, her body deliberately preserved to delay discovery. In June 1936, Florence Polillo, 44 years old, was found dismembered and wrapped. She had last been seen alive with a man later interrogated, but never charged. And her lifestyle, transient, alcoholic, quietly diminished urgency around her death. In July 1936, another unidentified male victim was found, again headless, again carefully cut apart, again left near rail lines. By September 1936, the two more bodies surfaced within weeks of each other. One male and one female, both unidentified, both reduced to torsos with limbs and heads missing. The killer was accelerating. In 1937, remains believed to belong to Rose Wallace were recovered, though identification was never conclusively proven, a woman who vanished into the case without certainty, even in death. Officially, the case closed without resolution. Unofficially, at least 12 victims, possibly more than 20, were never named, never claimed, and never fully counted. What the timeline shows isn't randomness, but refinement. Bodies appearing closer together, cuts growing cleaner, disposal sites becoming bolder. There may be more victims because the case itself was built on disappearance, not discovery. Cleveland in the 1930s was full of people who lived outside records: transients, riding the rails, migrant laborers, sex workers, alcoholics, men and women cycling through flop houses in shanty towns like Kingsbury Run. People vanished constantly, and most were never reported missing. If no one filed a report, no body was searched for, and if no body was found intact, no murder was officially counted. The torso killer didn't just kill, he dismantled the evidence. The methods we've already outlined weren't just violent. They were designed to erase records. Some remains were found months after death. Others were so decomposed investigators couldn't even say with certainty how many pieces belonged to the same person. There's also the geography: rivers that could carry remains far from Cleveland, rail lines that cut through multiple jurisdictions, industrial waste zones where a body could be destroyed completely. And then there's the human factor. Once panic set in, police began attributing suspicious remains to non-related drownings, accidents, or unrelated violence to avoid admitting the scope of the problem. Eliot Ness himself privately believed the official count was low. Modern criminologists agree. When you factor in unidentified remains, missing persons never linked, and bodies likely never recovered at all, the number almost certainly exceeds 12, possibly by a lot. The most unsettling possibility isn't that we missed a few victims. It's that the killer learned early on exactly how many people could disappear before anyone noticed and adjusted his method accordingly. Eliot Ness didn't step into the torso murders because he wanted to. He was forced into them by embarrassment, pressure, and fear that Cleveland was slipping out of control. By the mid-1930s, Ness was already a national symbol, the Prohibition hero who helped bring down Al Capone. Cleveland hired him as public safety director in 1935 to clean up corruption, modernize policing, and reassure a city struggling with the Depression. Then the bodies started stacking up. Headless torsos near rail lines, limbs pulled from the river, national newspapers drawing comparisons to European war crimes. Local police were overwhelmed, divided by jurisdiction, and quietly outmatched. When the murders escalated in 1935 and 1936, the city couldn't afford for this to look like routine failure, not with a famous lawman in charge. So Ness became the face of the response. He centralized the investigation, brought in forensic specialists, and personally reviewed crime scene reports. But the case exposed the limits of even a celebrated reformer. By this point, Ness had already shifted from investigation to containment. Every body dumped after Ness took over sent a quiet message: your reputation doesn't scare me, your badge doesn't reach where I work, and your city will protect me by refusing to see my victims as people. Ness didn't fail because he wasn't trying. He failed because this killer wasn't breaking the law in public. He was exploiting the blind spots of American justice itself. Frank Dolezal was arrested in 1936 in connection with the murder of Florence Polillo. He was a Czech immigrant, a laborer, poor, isolated, and easy to pressure. Police interrogated him for days. He eventually confessed, then recanted, saying the confession was coerced. There was no physical evidence tying him to any of the torso murders beyond association with Polillo. While awaiting trial in the Cuyahoga County Jail, Dolezal was found dead in his cell in August 1939. Official ruling: suicide by hanging. Physical reality: Dolezal had 6 broken ribs. His neck injuries were inconsistent with a typical hanging. The medical examiner noted injuries that suggested prior physical trauma, not a clean, self-inflicted death. Guards could not clearly explain when or how the injuries occurred. Regardless of which explanation is true, Dolezal's death conveniently ended scrutiny without solving anything. There are three serious possibilities historians still debate. He was beaten during interrogation and the damage caught up with him later. This is the most conservative explanation. Brutal interrogations were common. Broken ribs don't happen by accident. If he was already injured, a staged or poorly supervised suicide could have finished it. He was killed to close the case. Dolezal's death conveniently ended public pressure. No trial, no cross-examination, no exposure of coercive police tactics. The city could quietly move on. This doesn't require a grand conspiracy, just negligence or a willful turning away. He actually killed himself after being physically broken. Even if he tied the knot himself, the conditions that led there matter. A man beaten, isolated, humiliated, and blamed for murders he likely didn't commit may have seen no way out. That still makes the system complicit. What's critical is this: Dolezal's death did not solve the torso murders. The killing stopped, but no evidence emerged linking him to the full series. Modern criminologists overwhelmingly believe he was not the torso killer. So was he murdered? Legally, no proof. Historically, deeply suspicious. Morally, the system failed him. And that failure matters because once Dolezal died, the city had a convenient ending, a dead suspect, a closed narrative, and a killer who never had to answer to anyone. Why Frank Dolezal doesn't fit the torso killer's profile comes down to skill, behavior, and consistency, and he fails all three. The skill mismatch is glaring. The torso killer dismembered bodies with clean anatomical precision. Joints were separated methodically. Cuts were controlled. Heads and hands were removed deliberately, not hacked off in panic. Some bodies showed signs of chemical preservation or delayed disposal. This points to someone calm, practiced, and comfortable around human anatomy, possibly medical, mortuary, or industrial. Frank Dolezal had none of that. He was a laborer, no medical training, no evidence he could perform controlled dissections repeatedly without mistakes. One clean dismemberment is hard. A dozen over years without error is expertise. Behaviorally, the torso killer was organized and emotionally detached. He didn't confess. He didn't brag publicly. He didn't spiral. He escalated methodically and stopped when it suited him. Dolezal did the opposite. He confessed under pressure, then recanted. He contradicted himself. He showed confusion, distress, and fear. That pattern fits a coerced suspect, not a serial killer who had already outwitted police, the press, and Eliot Ness for years. Serial offenders who operate at that level don't suddenly crumble into incoherent admissions when questioned. The timeline doesn't work. The torso murders span several years with consistent methods. There is no solid evidence placing Dolezal near most of the crime scenes, no proof he had access to the victims, and no explanation for how he could maintain the same controlled process across time, locations, and victims without detection while living a chaotic, monitored life. One man killing one woman he knew is plausible. One man executing a long-running, technically precise serial murder campaign without slipping is not. Then there's motive and victim selection. The torso killer targeted people who were socially invisible, transients, sex workers, the poor, regardless of gender. This suggests detachment, not personal grievance. Dolezal's only connection was Florence Polillo, someone he knew. That's personal. The torso killer wasn't personal. He was systematic. Finally, there's the convenience factor. Dolezal was poor, foreign-born, isolated, and expendable. When he died in custody, the pressure stopped. The city got a quiet ending without proof. That doesn't mean police framed him deliberately. It means they accepted an answer that allowed them to move on. The torso killings appear to stop after Frank Dolezal died in jail in 1939. but that timing is misleading. What actually changed wasn't the killer, it was the environment. The city finally had a convenient ending. With Dolezal dead, Cleveland could quietly treat the case as resolved without ever proving it. No trial, no defense, no cross-examination of police tactics, no public reckoning. The press moved on. Public fear cooled. Once the spotlight faded, the killer no longer needed to perform. Law enforcement tactics changed the landscape. Eliot Ness ordered the destruction of Kingsbury Run's shantytowns, burning camps, clearing rail yards, dispersing transients. That didn't catch the killer, but it destroyed the disposal zones he'd relied on. His victims didn't disappear because he stopped killing. They disappeared because the city erased the places where bodies could be dumped unnoticed. The killer likely adapted. Serial offenders don't always escalate forever. Some relocate, some change methods. Some stop dumping bodies where they'll be found. The torso killer had already demonstrated patience, planning, and learning. Once Cleveland became hostile terrain, more patrols, fewer hiding places, less anonymity, continuing the same pattern would have been reckless. It is possible the killings never truly stopped at all. They just stopped being recognized as part of the same series. Bodies in rivers get ruled drownings. Dismembered remains get attributed to accidents or unrelated crimes. In the 1930s, without DNA, without centralized databases, without cross-jurisdiction communication, it was easy for a pattern to dissolve into paperwork. Dolezal's death gave Cleveland closure. The killer never needed it. For years, the torso murders have been framed as chaos, a madman, a butcher, a faceless monster who vanished into history. That version is comforting because chaos doesn't ask hard questions. But when you strip away the noise, when you line up the cuts, the timing, the locations, and the failures, the picture narrows. This wasn't random, it wasn't impulsive, and it wasn't someone who slipped through the cracks by accident. It was someone who understood bodies, understood authority, and understood exactly how much protection silence could offer. Cleveland didn't fail to find him because there were no suspects. It failed because the most dangerous suspect wasn't expendable. He didn't live in the shanty towns. He wasn't nameless. He had training, a family name, and just enough insulation to keep the case from ever reaching daylight. And once you accept that, once you stop looking for a drifter or a laborer or a convenient confession, there's only one name that consistently rises to the surface, not because it was proven, but because it was never allowed to be. The man investigators kept circling back to was Francis Sweeney, and unlike the others, he didn't surface because he was convenient. He surfaced because he fit. Sweeney was a World War I veteran with documented medical training, the kind of background that explains what no other suspect could, the precision. These weren't sloppy cuts made in panic. Joints were separated cleanly. Heads and hands were removed deliberately. Bodies were processed, not butchered. In some cases, they were chemically treated, suggesting knowledge of decomposition and preservation. That level of control doesn't come from desperation or rage. It comes from familiarity. Sweeney also had a long history of alcoholism, instability, and violent behavior after the war, a pattern consistent with offenders who compartmentalize, chaotic in life, controlled in ritual. He was questioned multiple times and failed at least 2 polygraph examinations, enough to keep Eliot Ness personally focused on him long after other suspects faded. And Ness didn't pursue Sweeney loudly. He pursued him quietly because Sweeney wasn't powerless. He was related to a prominent Cleveland politician, and charging him would have meant a public fight the city wasn't prepared to have. Instead, the investigation stalled. Sweeney was released, never tried, never cleared. What followed is where the case turns unsettling. Over the years, Sweeney allegedly sent mocking postcards to Ness, taunting him about the murders, reminding him of what he couldn't prove. It wasn't the behavior of an innocent man desperate to escape suspicion. It was the behavior of someone who believed he'd already won. Eventually, Sweeney was committed to a mental institution, removed from public life without ever being held accountable. And after that, the torso killings stopped. No arrest, no trial, no justice, just silence. That doesn't make Francis Sweeney legally guilty, but when you line up the skill set, the access, the psychology, the political protection, and the timing, he fits the profile in a way no one else does. The deadly truth isn't that we don't know who did this. It's that the one man who made the most sense was never allowed to face the question in the open. If you follow the behavioral evidence, Francis Sweeney could have been killing for years longer than the official timeline admits, possibly a decade or more. Here's why that matters. Serial offenders don't start fully formed, they escalate. And by the time Cleveland noticed a pattern, this killer was already operating with confidence, precision, and consistency. Signs of someone well past a first offense. The earliest victims, including the so-called Lady of the Lake, show the same core behaviors seen later: decapitation, dismemberment, strategic disposal. That suggests the method wasn't being tested. It was already established, which means the learning phase likely happened earlier, somewhere bodies were never found, never linked, or never counted. Sweeney returned from World War I in 1919, medically trained, psychologically damaged, and reportedly unstable. The 1920s were a decade of movement, alcoholism, and institutional invisibility for men like him, especially veterans drifting between cities, hospitals, and jobs. That decade is a black hole in the record. No centralized missing persons tracking, no forensic databases, plenty of waterways, rail lines, and industrial dumping grounds. If he began killing in the 1920s, there would be no reliable way to prove it. There's also the refinement factor. The torso killer didn't escalate sloppily. He refined. Cuts stayed clean. Disposal became more deliberate. That kind of control usually appears after repetition, not experimentation. Most criminologists would argue that killer had already committed multiple successful murders before Cleveland ever connected the dots. And then there's the endpoint. The killings stop when Sweeney is institutionalized. That doesn't suggest a natural burnout. It suggests removal of access. When offenders stop abruptly without replacement patterns, it usually means incarceration, hospitalization, death, or forced isolation, not moral awakening. So how long could he have been doing this? Conservatively, it could be 4 to 5 years beyond the official timeline. Realistically, maybe 10 plus years, including undetected victims. Worst case, it's killing intermittently until institutionalization, which leads to the most unsettling conclusion of all. The torso murders may not represent the beginning of a killer. They may represent the moment he finally became visible, and by then it was already far too late. There is an explanation, not a neat one, but a consistent one, and it has nothing to do with insanity in the movie sense and everything to do with control, symbolism, and rehearsal. Here's what the behavior tells us. Murder ends a life. What happened after death is where the offender's psychology lives. Dismemberment, decapitation, castration, preservation, those are post-mortem choices. They don't increase lethality, they increase ownership. This killer wasn't trying to get away quickly. He was staying with the body. Dismemberment equals depersonalization and mastery. Taking a body apart isn't rage. Rage is messy. This was systematic. Breaking the human form into components does two things psychologically. It turns a person into an object. It allows the offender to feel technically superior. I understand how you're built. This is common in offenders who feel chronically powerless in life but competent in ritualized settings. The body becomes a space where they finally feel in control. Decapitation and removal of hands equals erasing identity. Heads and hands are how we identify people. Removing them isn't just practical, it's symbolic. No face, no fingerprints, no name. The victim isn't just dead, they're unpersoned. That points to someone who didn't just want to avoid capture, but wanted the victim erased, likely because they themselves felt erased or unseen. Castration equals power, not sex. This is crucial. Castration in serial homicide is almost never about sexual gratification. It's about neutralizing threat and asserting dominance. It often appears in offenders who struggle with masculinity, carry humiliation or inadequacy, experience rage toward bodies as symbols, not individuals. It's not arousal driven, it's status driven. Preservation and chemical treatment equals ownership over time. This is the most disturbing part psychologically. Preserving a body delays decay, meaning the offender is extending the relationship beyond death. That tells us the act didn't end at the kill, time mattered, the body was being managed, not discarded. This aligns with offenders who experience anxiety around loss of control and use ritual to stabilize themselves. So what kind of person does this? Not a frantic psychopath, not a mad butcher, not a sadist in the obvious sense. This points to someone who was highly compartmentalized, comfortable with anatomy, emotionally detached during acts, likely humiliated or diminished in daily life, drawn to ritual, precision, and repetition. In short, someone who felt small in the world and enormous only when a body was silent and compliant. Why public placement afterward? Because the display completes the loop. The killer wasn't just saying, "I killed you." He was saying, "I decide when you're seen." That's why the bodies were staged for discovery. That's why the killer didn't hide them permanently. That's why fear mattered. This wasn't secrecy. It was message delivery. The deadly truth. This wasn't sexual thrill. This was identity repair through domination. And that's why it didn't stop easily. That's why it didn't escalate chaotically. That's why it looks deliberate. The killer wasn't trying to destroy bodies. He was trying to prove something to himself over and over until the world finally noticed. When you place the torso murders beside the Elizabeth Short killing, the similarities aren't superficial. They're structural. In both cases, the violence doesn't peak at death. It begins after. Elizabeth Short was bisected cleanly at the waist, drained of blood, scrubbed, posed, and displayed in an open lot. Like the torso victims, her body was treated as an object to be arranged, not a person to be disposed of. The cuts were precise, controlled, and unemotional. That alone rules out panic or spontaneous rage. What differs is focus. The torso killer erased identity by removing heads and hands, turning victims into anonymity itself. The Dahlia killer did the opposite, leaving Short's face intact, posed, unmistakable. One offender erased the person, the other weaponized recognition, but the psychology underneath is strikingly similar. Both offenders show signs of anatomical familiarity, ritualized post-mortem behavior, and a need to control how the body is seen. Neither hid their work, both staged it. That tells us these weren't crimes of secrecy, they were crimes of authorship. The killer wasn't asking, will they find the body? He was deciding how they would find it. In profiling terms, that places both offenders in the same psychological family. Organized, methodical, emotionally detached, and driven by domination rather than sexual frenzy. Not psychosis, not loss of control, precision. And that precision explains why killers like this often stop abruptly rather than escalate forever. Popular culture teaches escalation, more victims, more brutality, but real offenders who rely on ritual don't always follow that arc. When the ritual is disrupted, the behavior collapses. In Cleveland, once disposal sites were destroyed, attention intensified, and a suspect was quietly removed into institutional life, the conditions that allowed control disappeared. The offender didn't need to kill to feel powerful anymore, or couldn't kill without risking exposure. In the Dahlia case, we see something similar, no confirmed repeat crime with the same signature afterward. That doesn't mean the killer was caught. It means the loop was broken. These offenders don't kill compulsively, they kill strategically. When the strategy fails, when the environment changes, when scrutiny becomes too personal, when the body can no longer be managed on their terms, stopping is safer than adapting. That's the connective tissue between Cleveland and Los Angeles. Different cities, different victims, same deadly truth. The most dangerous killers aren't the ones who lose control. They're the ones who know exactly when to stop. When you strip away era, location, and mythology, and you look only at psychology and behavior, some comparisons rise to the top and others fall apart fast. Closest match is Dennis Rader, not because of brutality, but because of control. Rader killed selectively, ritualized the act, and then stopped, not out of remorse, but because stopping served him. He compartmentalized perfectly. Family man on the surface, godlike control in private. Like the torso killer, he wasn't compulsive. He was strategic. He understood timing, risk, and when silence was safer than action. Then there is Jack the Ripper. This comparison holds because of anatomical focus and victim selection. Both targeted the socially invisible. Both showed comfort with cutting into the human body. Both staged discovery rather than concealment. Where they diverge is emotional tone. Ripper was frenzied and expressive. The torso killer was colder, quieter, more methodical. Same foundation, different execution. So if you're looking for the truest comparison, it isn't the loudest killer or the most grotesque. It's the one who knew how to live quietly, kill deliberately, and stop when it benefited him. And that's why this killer doesn't feel historical. He feels familiar. Sweeney was never arrested for the torso murders. He was never charged. He was never tried. What happened instead was administrative removal, not justice. After repeated police attention, failed polygraphs, and growing concern about his mental stability, Sweeney's family intervened. That part matters. Commitment in the 1930s wasn't driven by civil rights or due process the way it is now. It was often driven by family petitions, medical affidavits, and political discretion. Sweeney was a dead veteran, diagnosed with severe alcoholism, increasingly unstable and violent, publicly embarrassing if prosecuted, privately alarming if left alone. Rather than force a public criminal case they couldn't prove, the system took a quieter path. He was committed to a state mental institution on grounds of mental illness and inability to function safely. This removed him from society without requiring evidence and without a trial that could expose investigative failures or political protection. In short, he wasn't committed because he was proven guilty. He was committed because he was dangerous enough to remove and connected enough to avoid court. Sweeney did not die shortly after commitment. He lived decades longer. He remained institutionalized for much of his life, cycling through hospitals, largely forgotten by the public. No dramatic ending, no confession, no reckoning. He died in 1964 of natural causes while still under institutional care. No deathbed admission, no final note, no resolution. This is the most unsettling part of the case. If Sweeney was the killer, he never faced justice, but he also never returned to society. If he wasn't, he still lost his freedom without trial. Either way, the outcome tells you exactly how the system worked in that era. Poor suspects were crushed publicly, connected suspects were disappeared quietly, and the truth was treated as optional if silence was more convenient. The torso murders didn't end with an arrest, they ended with containment, and that's why this case still matters. Because it shows how easily a serial killer could be stopped without ever being named and how easily the truth could be buried along with the bodies. People like to say this case could never be solved today, that it belongs to another era. No DNA, no databases, no technology, too much time lost, too many bodies unnamed, too many mistakes made early. And on the surface, that sounds reasonable. But it's also a lie, or at least a convenient one. What really made the Cleveland torso murders unsolvable wasn't science, it was structure. Victims were poor, transient, undocumented, or socially invisible, which meant their disappearances didn't trigger alarms. Jurisdictions didn't share information. Police departments competed instead of cooperating. Political pressure dictated who could be pursued and who couldn't. And once a suspect became inconvenient, the system chose containment over confrontation. That's not a forensic failure. That's a human one. If this case happened today, the tools would exist. DNA could be extracted from preserved remains. Chemical residues could be analyzed. Victim timelines could be reconstructed across states. Behavioral profiling would narrow suspects quickly. Institutional records would expose movement patterns. Medical training histories would be flagged. The killer wouldn't be invisible, not because we're smarter now, but because the margins are harder to disappear into. The reality is this case didn't fail because the killer was too clever. It failed because accountability stopped where power began, because victims without advocates were easier to forget than suspects with protection were to confront. The truth isn't that the torso murders belong to the past. It's that the same conditions still exist, just quieter, better managed, and more carefully explained away. If Francis Sweeney was responsible, the work almost certainly happened in multiple controlled, semi-private spaces, not one dramatic lair. Kingsbury Run wasn't just shacks. It was surrounded by abandoned factories, rail sheds, boiler rooms, maintenance buildings, and unused municipal structures. These places had concrete floors, easy cleanup, drains, water access, noise cover from trains and industry, no regular oversight. A person could work undisturbed for hours without anyone asking questions. Dismemberment doesn't require elegance. It requires privacy, tools, and time. This area offered all three. Medical or institutional spaces with after-hours access. This matters because of the precision. Sweeney had medical training and veteran status. That opens doors. Hospitals, clinics, morgues, VA facilities, and training labs in the 1920s to 30s had shockingly loose security, especially at night. Records were paper. Oversight was informal. Keys circulated. Even temporary access, a night shift, an unlocked room, borrowed space would be enough. Bodies could be processed quickly and then moved elsewhere for disposal. Private rental rooms or boarding houses, not glamorous, but effective. Cheap boarding houses were common, especially for veterans and alcoholics. Privacy was minimal, but transience was normal. Smells, noise, odd hours. None of that raised alarms if rent was paid. Smaller victims or partial dismemberment could happen here, with final processing elsewhere. River-adjacent utility spaces, the Cuyahoga wasn't just water, it was infrastructure. Pump stations, flood-control tunnels, maintenance access points, and culverts offered running water, isolation, direct disposal routes. Some remains were found in states that suggest processing near water, not just dumping into it. Why not a single kill site? Because this killer didn't need one. This wasn't a fantasy dungeon offender. This was a mobile, adaptive, practical killer. Multiple locations reduce risk. If one space becomes unsafe, you abandon it. That's exactly what the timeline suggests. Not a fixed base, but a network of usable environments. The Cleveland torso murders don't end with a handcuff click or a courtroom verdict. They end the way some truths always do. Buried under convenience, silence, and time. The bodies were found, the patterns were visible, the suspect made sense, and still, no one stood up and said the name out loud in a room where it mattered. A poor man died in a cell, a connected man disappeared into institutions. A famous lawman lived long enough to know exactly where the line failed, and the killer, whoever he truly was, never had to answer for what he took. This case isn't horrifying because it's unsolved. It's horrifying because it worked. It shows how easily a system can protect itself by deciding which lives count, which questions get asked, and which truths are allowed to surface. That's why this story still matters, not because of the gore, not because of the mystery, but because the same conditions that allowed these murders to vanish still exist. Just quieter now, better documented, and easier to explain away. When we say the past is dead, we lie. The past isn't gone, it's unresolved. If this episode mattered to you, don't let it disappear quietly. Follow Deadly Truths on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube so these stories stay visible. Rate the show, leave a review, and share this episode with someone who understands that unresolved history still shapes the present. That's how forgotten victims get remembered. and how uncomfortable truths stay alive. And to everyone who's been listening, following, and staying with this show as it's grown, thank you. This audience gets it. You don't come here for shock. You don't come here for myths. You come here for facts, context, and the parts of history that were buried on purpose. Your support is the reason these stories don't vanish again. I'm Becca, and this has been Deadly Truths. The past isn't dead, it's just doing time in the dark.